Grinston, Executive Director for the Board of Pharmacy. Thank you for joining us for the board's webinar, Sterile Compounding 1 Year Later. We have a lot of great information that Inspector Katie DeBold is going to share with you on today. Before we begin our program, I wanted to let everyone know that the board is hosting a patient safety conference on October 24th, 2017 in St. Charles, Missouri. Information about the patient safety conference is available on the board's website. Registration is free and open to any member of the public. It has been board approved for 5.5 continuing education hours. So as you listen to the regulatory information, today we invite you to join us for our patient safety conference as well. Once again, I think it's going to be a very good webinar with a lot of good information. Having said that, thank you for joining us. We now turn it over to Inspector Katie DeBold.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining today. As Kim said, my name is Katie DeBold. I'm an inspector with the Missouri Board of Pharmacy, and today I'm just going to be reviewing some sterile compounding compliance issues that we've had following the year of rule revisions. So just some housekeeping stuff to get started. The webinar will be in muted listen-only mode for all the participants. You should be able to listen on your computer. However, if you're having problems with the audio, you can go ahead and dial in with the telephone number that is shown on your webinar. For continuing education, this webinar is approved for 1 hour of live pharmacist continuing education. You must be officially signed in and logged on via your computer. So if you have a group of people watching together on one screen, only the person that is signed in will get the CE. The CE credit is not issued to those that are listening over the phone. After the webinar is completed, you will do a post survey within 48 hours. We'll provide instructions on how to do that at the end of the webinar. And just keep in mind that the CE credit is not submitted to the CPE monitor. Instead, the board office will be mailing you a CE certificate. For the handouts for today's webinar, they were posted on the board's website. It's just a copy of the slides. And the webinar is also being recorded. You can find a link under the Publications and Resources link on the board's website. There is no CE credit for watching the recorded version. If you have questions, you can go ahead and enter those on the question box on your GoToWebinar screen. However, this is time permitting. If we have time, we'll do questions. If not, we won't have time. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today's webinar objectives are to review common areas of noncompliance for sterile compounding pharmacies since the rule was revised last year. And then we'll also review strategies to improve compliance for those issues. And we'll answer questions if time allows. So where were we 1 year ago? Sterile compounding regulations were being revised. The emergency rule was published on August 4th, 2016. The board had decided to go ahead and change some things that were outdated that needed some updating. They collected some public comments on the emergency rule and then made some slight revisions. And after those slight revisions were made, the final rule was published in January of this year, 2017. Since then, we have created a sterile compounding inspection report, which most of you have probably seen. This is a snapshot of what it looks like. It is basically a checklist that allows the pharmacists to see every regulation that we're referring to and all of our inspection criteria. That has been a really handy tool for both the inspectors and our licensees. So where are we now? Currently, we have 92 pharmacies with Class H in the state of Missouri that are conducting sterile compounding. I didn't include out-of-state pharmacies in this number, so this is just in-state pharmacies. And to gather data regarding the common areas of noncompliance, I reviewed 50 inspection reports from sterile compounding pharmacies throughout the state, starting in January of 2017 when we released that inspection checklist. So out of those 50 pharmacies, 60% were conducting risk level 1, 32% were conducting risk level 2 sterile compounding, and then 8% of those were conducting risk level 3, which is the non-sterile to sterile compounding. So the top 10 areas of noncompliance are as follows. I'll go through all of these in more detail, but they include sterile compounding policies and procedures, cleaning and disinfection of your buffer or controlled area, aseptic technique skill assessment, review of certification reports, cleaning and disinfection of the primary engineering control, garbing, in-use times, proper aseptic technique, maintenance of your controlled or buffer area, and then remedial investigations. So the first area of noncompliance that we're going to review is sterile compounding policies and procedures. So Section 2 of the sterile compounding regulations say that your sterile compounding policies and procedures should encompass or must encompass all aspects of compounding, and those must be reviewed on an annual basis. So some common observations or violations that we see when we're out inspecting is that the policies and procedures are incomplete. So either it doesn't include all the aspects of sterile compounding, so we're missing topics completely altogether that should be in there, or maybe they just aren't quite detailed enough. So there's maybe 2 lines about a topic and we are looking for a little more detail. Some other common things we see are failure to review the policies and procedures on an annual basis, and then a failure to follow your own policy and procedure. So ways to improve compliance around these areas is to, number 1, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and do a thorough review of your sterile compounding policies and procedures to ensure that the following topics are covered. These are at a minimum. Of course, if your pharmacy is performing things that aren't on this list, they should also be included, but this is a good place to kind of get you started. So the first topic should be a policy and procedure about how you're going to train your sterile compounding personnel. So any new employees that you get, what sort of training are they going to undergo? So this would include didactic training, any videos they're going to watch, written tests they're going to perform, calculations, just something that describes that whole process. The next topic would be media fill testing, which a lot of times is kind of included with the training policy and procedure, so you could kind of include those to be in one policy and procedure, or they could be 2 separate ones. What we're looking for in the media fill testing policy and procedure is that there is a complete procedure of the media fill test that's included. So we want to see specifically how you're going to perform that media fill test. Some people like to use the manufacturer's recommended instructions, and if that suits your pharmacy, if it represents the most challenging or worst case scenario for you, that is appropriate. However, you should reference those manufacturer instructions or even keep a copy of them in your policies and procedures. You also want to identify the type of media that you're going to be using, how you're going to incubate the temperature for how long, or incubate the media fill for how long and at what temperature, and then also a process for dealing with any failed media fill tests. You want to include a policy and procedure about beyond use dating, how you're assigning your beyond use dates to your sterile preparations, a recovery time for your primary engineering control. So if your primary engineering control is ever shut off for any reason, the amount of time that it takes for the primary engineering control to start back up and resume ISO class 5 conditions. So a lot of times I hear people tell me, oh, well, we keep our primary engineering controls running all the time. And that's all good and fine, but you need to account for things such as power outages or unexpected failures in which your hood is off for any amount of time. So in this case, it's still necessary to identify what that recovery time is and then include it in your policies and procedures. If you're not sure what it is, you can reference your manufacturer manual or talk to maybe your certifier about the recovery time. Next topic is going to be cleaning and disinfection. This should be a very thorough policy and procedure since it's an important piece of sterile compounding. You want to include procedures for the cleaning and disinfection activities, the approved agents that your pharmacy is using, their schedules of use, and how they are applied. Some more topics to include environmental sampling, so air and surface sampling that either your pharmacy or your certifier is conducting, so we're looking for viable microorganisms in your air or your surface, how you're doing that. Remedial investigations kind of goes along with environmental sampling, so if you ever have any microorganisms come back within your air or surface sampling, what actions you would take, and that includes how you will deal with any highly pathogenic microorganisms that are identified. And we'll talk more detail about that whole process towards the end of the webinar, but you definitely want to have a policy and procedure for that process. Hazardous drugs, if it's applicable. Use of automated compounding devices and calibration of those machines if you have them, and then risk level 3 procedures if you're doing risk level 3. So things like end product testing, sterility, endotoxin testing, potency testing, and then quarantine procedures, emergency dispensing procedures, things like that. So after you've done that, just that initial review, then you want to make sure that you are still reviewing your policies and procedures on an annual basis thereafter. And you want to make sure that you're reviewing all of these policies and procedures with your staff as well, so that it doesn't do any good if just one person looks at the policies and procedures but no one knows that changes have been implemented. So always review your changes with your staff when you can. It's a good idea to put reminders on your calendar or to plan to do the review around the same time as another scheduled activity. So if you always do your media fills a certain time of year, just keep in the back of your mind that, oh, I need to also review my sterile compounding policies and procedures at that time. And you want to make sure that this document, this review of the policies and procedures is documented somewhere. So whether you just create a signature log that you sign off on, or whether you document that electronically on the policy itself, however you want to do it works as long as you document it. Also, when you're going through your policies and procedures, you want to make sure that your current operations are reflected accurately in your policies and procedures. So a lot of times we'll write on an observation that pharmacies aren't following their own policies and procedures, and this could be because their policies and procedures are either outdated or maybe they're including a process that we aren't seeing on inspection. So you want to make sure that, especially with the rules recently being changed, that your current operations are reflected accurately in your policies and procedures. So an example would be garbing. In the past, for risk level 1, we didn't require a lot of garbing, so sometimes we still see policies and procedures that reference the older garbing requirements instead of the new ones. So make sure that all of that has been updated. The next area of noncompliance that we see is cleaning and disinfection of controlled and buffer areas. So there's two kind of pieces that we normally see. One revolves around the documentation of the cleaning records, and the other is observational-based type violation. So the cleaning just isn't adequate in your controlled or buffer area. So regarding the documentation of your cleaning records, when an inspector is reviewing, months worth of cleaning records, will a lot of times see holes in the cleaning records. So maybe they'll just be missing an entire week of documentation where it looks like no one documented any cleaning, or maybe it's 3 days every week, or maybe an entire category is just missing, so there's no space on the form to document monthly cleaning, and all of those would be examples of inconsistent documentation. And then the other category is inadequate cleaning. So when the inspector garbs up and goes into the controlled or buffer area, they see dust and debris that indicate that the cleaning wasn't done accurately. Some common areas that we see are return vents. Those tend to gather a lot of dust because they're filtering a lot of air, and the slats aren't being cleaned individually, so they tend to gather a lot of dust there. Behind, under, or on top of the primary engineering controls tend to gather a lot of debris if people aren't moving them to clean, or they're just kind of big and bulky and they just don't feel like doing it. I'm not really sure the reason behind it, but there are two pictures to your right there that kind of show the one on the very far right with the X is a picture of the top of a primary engineering control, so that was pretty dusty, and then the picture to the left is actually behind a primary engineering control that was kind of against the wall, and there you can see there was some debris and dust that was back there that no one had cleaned in a while. Another area that people tend to forget is supply bins or storage shelving. You can see that picture I provided is quite dusty. Under fatigue mats, people forget to pick those up and clean underneath. And then ledges or baseboards that are near the floor tend to collect a lot of dust. So make sure those areas are being cleaned on a routine basis. So ways to improve your compliance for cleaning and disinfection. First of all, you want to ensure that your employees are cleaning adequately. So this would include providing employees with a dedicated date and time to perform cleaning activities. Cleaning is a very time-intensive activity, especially if it's done appropriately. So you want to provide employees with a dedicated time to be able to do the cleaning. If they're only slatted 15 minutes to do the cleaning and then the rest of the day they're just compounding, that's not going to be enough time, and they're going to cut corners, make shortcuts, or just skip it altogether if they feel pressured that, oh, I have 20 IVs I need to do before I leave. So make sure that you provide employees with a dedicated date and time to actually perform those cleaning activities. You want to make sure that your employees are trained appropriately. So this would include cleaning, teaching practices like cleaning cleanest to dirtiest, selecting the right cleaning materials, going over those commonly missed areas so that people are they know the proper frequencies of what is supposed to be cleaned in there and that they're doing it appropriately. Some people will even hire outside of pharmacy personnel to come in and do cleaning, so a housekeeping type service or environmental services will come in and do the more thorough cleaning. And you want to make sure that those employees are trained as well, because they might not be as familiar with how to clean a clean room if they're just used to cleaning offices or what have you. So make sure they're trained appropriately. And a way to ensure that they're trained appropriately is to observe them to make sure they're competent in those cleaning and disinfection activities. So we'll talk a little bit later about annual reassessments of competencies, and this would be one area in which you'd be observing them to make sure that they're cleaning accurately. Outside of just the annual cleaning competencies, you should also just perform frequent audits of the buffer controlled area. A lot of people have windows where you can look into the IV room and kind of monitor the activity that's going in there, and that's great, but in order to see that dust and debris, you really have to garb up and get into those areas to see if the area is dusty or if people are forgetting to move things when they're cleaning. So it's a good idea to pop in there and make sure that it still looks clean. If possible, I also recommend to reduce the amount of supplies and materials that are stored in the buffer controlled area. It kind of serves two purposes. One is that there's less to clean in there, and then it's also less particle generation. So the more stuff that's in there, the more areas for dust and debris are to accumulate. So it's better just to get rid of as much stuff as you can in that buffer controlled area. If you're having problems with documentation, I recommend utilizing a type of record-keeping system that's convenient for your pharmacy. So some people like the old-school paper forms, and that works for a lot of people. Others are more attuned to their computers, so they have an Excel spreadsheet or something similar to that. Or there's even software-based programs out there that are really good about offering reminders and emails of sort to remind you to document your cleaning on a daily basis. You want to look at the forms that you have, whether it's paper or electronic, to make sure that the following activities are included on that form. So daily hood cleaning, daily floor cleaning, daily counters and work surfaces, so anything that's kind of a flat horizontal surface needs to be cleaned daily. And then monthly is going to include wall cleaning, ceiling cleaning, and then also supply bins and storage shelving. Again, like I said earlier, you want to make sure you're doing frequent audits. So you're looking at the record-keeping form that you're using to make sure that it's being filled out appropriately. And if you're still having problems, a lot of times it's a good idea to assign a supervisor or someone else that's not necessarily doing the cleaning to make sure that it is being checked off on a daily basis. So the next area of noncompliance is the aseptic technique skill assessment. This is Section 10 in the sterile compounding regulations, and the regulation states that all sterile compounding personnel must pass an aseptic technique skill assessment to verify competency. This assessment includes a direct visual observation of the aseptic competencies during a process simulation. So process simulation is a media fill test, and then while that media fill test is being performed, someone is observing the compounder and making sure that they're also competent in all these different aseptic technique competencies, which Section 10 does list out specifically what those are, and I'll be reviewing them here in a moment. So common aseptic technique skill assessment violations that inspectors will see is that the visual observation is missing all of the required competencies, so it's missing either an entire category or maybe they just need a little more detail, or the assessment is not being completed at the appropriate frequency. So we'll see that people are completing their media fills late. So sometimes it's just a matter of a couple of weeks. There's been times when it's months late. So that's definitely an area that could use some improvement. So ways to improve your compliance for aseptic technique skill assessment include reviewing the forms that you have currently today. So the competency assessment form that you have whenever you are performing your media fill test, you should have a checklist or some type of form that reviews all the competencies that your employees are responsible for performing, and these are the topics that you should have. So you want to cover proper aseptic technique, manipulations, and work practices. So we'll want to see specific competencies such as the employees using proper use of first air, they're avoiding touch contamination for those critical sites, they are disinfecting appropriately, so they're using an alcohol pad to wipe off the vial ports, they're wiping off their materials before they place them in the primary engineering control. So it should be very specific practices of things that you're checking off that your employee is competent in. Cleaning and disinfection competency, again, we're looking for detailed items here. We don't just want one line that says cleaning and disinfection is done appropriately. We want to see what exactly are you assessing. So is your employee selecting the proper cleaning agent? Are they diluting it properly? Are they using it properly? Are they letting it sit for the proper amount of contact time? Are they cleaning, are the cleaning methods and procedures accurate? Do they know the frequencies of the cleaning? So it should be a more detailed type competency. And this is a common one that we see a lot of people are missing, is the cleaning and disinfection. Another one is hand hygiene, garbing, and gloving. So again, we're looking for details. So we want things such as the employee was able to wash their hands for 30 seconds, they went all the way up to their forearms, they removed debris from underneath their nails, they put on their hair bonnet correctly, they put on their mask correctly, etc. And then for gloving, that would apply for people that are donning sterile gloves, so risk level 2 and 3 employees need to don their sterile gloves appropriately. The next 3 are identifying, weighing, and measuring of ingredients. So this would include something like the proper use of a syringe to measure a drug, maintaining sterility in the ISO 5 area, and then also labeling and inspecting compounded sterile preparations. So once the preparation is complete, is the employee looking for particles, cores, are they looking for leaks, things like that. So you want to make sure that your competency form includes all of those areas. If you are doing things like TPNs, you're using an automated compounding device, or you're doing risk level 3 type procedures, you want to include competencies that relate to those as well. You want to make sure that the frequency of which you are completing this aseptic technique skill assessment is done on time. So like I mentioned, a lot of people we're running into people being late on their aseptic technique media fills, so I just wanted to give you guys a reminder of how often that should occur. For all the risk levels, an initial assessment needs to include prior to performing sterile compounding at your pharmacy. And again, just a reminder that the media fills, when you're first beginning sterile compounding, you have to complete 3 media fills before you're allowed to sterile compound. After that, a reassessment needs to occur every 12 months if you are doing risk level 1 and 2 compounding, or if you're doing risk level 3, you have to do it even more frequently, which is every 6 months. And remember, the reassessment includes not only the media fill test, but also that assessment of all the competencies that I just reviewed. So it's a good idea to use calendar reminders to help remind you of when people are due, and if it's possible, I find it easier to try to schedule all the reassessments during the same time of year. So then if it's October, you know every October, oh, it's media fill time and competency review time. Some people will try to pair them up to the same time of year that they do like annual review for like raises and that sort of thing. That way you kind of are assessing not only their normal pharmacy operation competencies, but then also the sterile compounding competencies all at the same time. It's a lot harder if you have, say you have 10 employees and they're all scheduled throughout the year. That's where people tend to get late because they just kind of forget about it. So the next topic is going to be the review of certification reports. So this is section 5 within the sterile compounding regulations. And the regulation states that all primary engineering controls in ISO classified areas shall be certified prior to beginning sterile compounding activities, so when you first bring in a new hood, and then every 6 months thereafter. It also says that the certification results shall be reviewed by a pharmacist once they're received, and the identity of the pharmacist that's conducting that review and the date of review shall be documented. So the observations that we see regarding certification reports is usually that someone is failing to look at those. So either the review is never conducted or it's done by someone other than a pharmacist, or a lot of times the pharmacist will verbally confirm that they are reviewing it, but there's just no documentation that that's happening. So ways to improve compliance regarding certification reports is to sign and date the certification report as soon as it's received. So just make that part of your normal process where you sign and date it as soon as you get it. If your pharmacy utilizes a record-keeping software of some sort, you could even create a task in there to remind you to document the certification review every 6 months. Some pharmacies like to create a form or a worksheet that they use that documents everything that they've looked at within the certification report. So as they're reviewing it, they use that document to kind of remind them everything to look at, and then they also sign and date that. So that is a technique that you can use. I've also seen that some certifiers will include a client signature portion on their form, so maybe question to see if that would be something that your certifier would be able to do, and then that way when you're looking at the form it kind of prompts you of, oh yeah, I need to actually sign off on this. So it kind of sounds like a silly paperwork type requirement, but there is actually a reason for it, and the reason is that a lot of times we've run across pharmacies that had some sort of deficiency or failure in their primary or secondary engineering controls, but no one knew about it because no one looked at the certification report. So that's kind of the basis of where this came from. So what should you be looking for when you're looking at the certification report? First of all, like I said, you want to look for any deficiencies or failures in any primary or secondary engineering controls that indicate that they need repairing, or usually certifiers are good, can be pretty good about predicting that something needs to be repaired. So they might say, oh, I think you're going to need a new HEPA filter next time we come, and then you can kind of prepare for that ahead of time. You want to make sure that the certifier tested all the appropriate equipment and that you received the appropriate documentation that goes along with that. So if you have 5 hoods tested, you should then receive 5 hood reports. So sometimes we'll see only the pharmacy only has 4 hood reports, and maybe the certifier did it, maybe they didn't, but it doesn't help for us to discover that 5 months down the road. You want to make sure that if you're paying the certifier to test all the equipment, that they're actually doing so and documenting that appropriately. You want to also ensure that the certifier is conducting all the appropriate tests and inspections, and that, again, those are documented appropriately. So one example would be particle counts. This is a really important thing to have on your certification report because it's basically what is telling us that your equipment is providing the ISO classified environment that you want. So for a hood, ISO 5. So they should be testing for particle counts, and you should have documentation of that. Another area that we see missing a lot of times is that the certifier is inspecting the pre-filter for the pharmacy on your laminar airflow workbenches, but that it's never documented. So if your certifier is inspecting your pre-filter for you, ensure that they're documenting that on the form appropriately. The next area of noncompliance is cleaning and disinfection of primary engineering controls. So this is section 17 in the regulations, and the regulations state that the primary engineering controls shall be cleaned with a germicidal detergent followed by sterile alcohol. The critical area shall also be cleaned and disinfected prior to compounding, between batches, and whenever contamination is suspected. So some common observations that we see regarding primary engineering controls is that they aren't being cleaned adequately, or maybe the right type of cleaning agent isn't being used. So germicidal detergent is not being used, is typically what we see when there's problems with the cleaning agent. So areas of the hood that aren't cleaned that we sometimes see on inspection are the spill tray. So the spill tray is just what it sounds like. It's a tray kind of underneath your work surface area that is there to collect drips and spills and things like that. And people, a lot of times you just need to unscrew it to clean it, but a lot of people don't realize that you can do that. It kind of depends on your unit, but usually they are accessible. So to the right I have a picture of a spill tray. It's usually located, you can look and see if it's dirty or not. It's usually underneath wherever the slats are near the edge of your primary engineering control. If you look down in there, that's the spill tray under there. So you can see in this picture, back behind the slats there's kind of some fuzzy unidentified material growing back there, which is obviously not ideal. We don't want that really close to our work surface area, so we want to make sure that we're cleaning those out. A lot of people forget to clean under their automated compounding devices. They're heavy. A lot of people just, don't move them to clean underneath, and then there's dried drug residue that can be under there. Another area we see is the screen that covers the pre-filter of the primary engineering control. So on the exterior of the primary engineering control, that tends to get dusty. And then also the ceiling, for some reason, when we observe employees cleaning out the hood, they tend to forget to clean the ceiling for some reason. So those are the areas that most often are not being cleaned and disinfected appropriately. So ways to improve Cleaning and disinfection in your primary engineering control. Again, you want to provide employees with a dedicated date and time to perform cleaning activities. So depending on how many hoods you have, it might be half an hour, it could be longer, but you want to make sure that they don't feel so rushed that they think that it's okay to skip their cleaning activities. You want to train your employees to clean and disinfect appropriately, and I will review how to do that on the next slides. And then you also want to observe your employees to ensure that they're competent in the cleaning and disinfection activities. So this would be a really great item to include on your annual aseptic technique skill assessment, is that they're cleaning the primary engineering control appropriately. So you could break down the competencies into each section that they're cleaning. So they're cleaning the top, the ceiling of the primary engineering control, they're cleaning the back of the primary engineering control, etc. And then outside of the annual assessment, you should be doing frequent audits, so popping in unexpectedly and observing what they're doing. A lot of times, if people don't know they're being watched, they'll act differently. So it's a good idea to just perform frequent audits and see what your employees are doing on a day-to-day basis instead of just waiting until the annual review. So just a quick review over how to clean primary engineering controls. So the following is a suggested order for cleaning within the primary engineering control. You want to keep in mind that you're always doing cleanest to dirtiest. So starting with the ceiling is typically the cleanest area of the primary engineering control. It's furthest from the work surface. And then you always want to clean top to bottom, back to front. So starting with the ceiling, starting in the back corner and working your way towards the compounder. Next will be the back of the primary engineering control, starting in the top and working your way down. Next is IV poles or hooks. Then the sides of the primary engineering control, again starting towards the back of the unit and working your way towards the compounder. Anything in the primary engineering control and underneath them, so sharps, containers, compounders, things like that. And then the work surface itself. You want to make sure that you're cleaning the ceiling or the back of the unit wherever your HEPA filter is located. A lot of people, they think that the HEPA filter shouldn't be touched or cleaned, and that's true, but the HEPA filter is protected by a metal grate. So if there wasn't a grate there for some reason, then you wouldn't want to touch it. But all the primary engineering controls I've seen always have that metal protective grate, so that needs to be cleaned and disinfected. You do want to be cautious about spraying anything into the filter. That is not advised. Instead, you'll want to spray it onto your wipe and then clean it that way. So like I mentioned earlier, all the surfaces are first cleaned with the germicidal detergent and then disinfected with sterile isopropyl alcohol. You want to use overlapping strokes, try to avoid circular motions, use a new wipe for each surface. Some people like to take a wipe and then fold it into quarters, and then they use a new quarter side for each surface, and that's also acceptable. Like I talked about earlier, cleaning the spill tray when it's needed. There isn't mandated frequency, but I would recommend at least monthly, or it's always easier to clean up a spill when you first notice it. So if it's a pretty big spill and you notice a lot of it is going into the spill tray, just go ahead and try to do it that same day. And then there's a few different things you have to keep in mind if you're using a compounding aseptic isolator. There are more things that you have to clean in there, so the sleeves, the front panel, trash chutes, things like that. It is tricky to clean it with the front panel closed, so it is okay to open that for cleaning purposes, and you can really get those hard to reach areas a little easier. You want to clean and disinfect the main chamber first because that's the cleanest area, then followed by the antechamber, since that's kind of the normal way that we process the materials. So that would be cleanest to dirtiest. So I often get asked a lot of times about germicidal detergents. What does that mean? How do I select them? So again, the primary engineering control must be cleaned daily with the germicidal detergent, followed by the sterile alcohol. And then throughout the day, after you've done just your regular daily cleaning throughout the day, you also need to disinfect frequently with sterile alcohol. So this is going to be anytime before you start compounding, in between batches, or whenever contamination is suspected, so a spill or something like that. As far as which germicidal detergent to clean, there are a lot of different ones to choose from. And when I'm using the word germicidal detergent, what I'm referring to is basically a clean room disinfectant that has an added cleanroom detergent to it. So the purpose of the cleanroom detergent is that it helps to remove any dirt or soil that could be there. The dirt or soil could be invisible to the human eye, but it's still there, and that needs to be removed in order for the disinfectant to work appropriately. So that's why the rule requires the use of a germicidal detergent, because it kind of encompasses that cleaning and disinfection step into one. So common types of cleanroom disinfectants that have the added cleanroom detergent include accelerated hydrogen peroxide, quaternary ammonium products, phenolics, and chlorine or bleach. So not all chlorine or bleach has the added cleanroom detergent, so you just kind of have to look. If you're looking at the bottle itself, a lot of time it'll say the words detergent or cleaning agent or something like that. That kind of helps. So I'm not allowed to recommend specific brands or manufacturers, but if you find a cleaning agent that you think will work but you're not really sure, just shoot me an email. I can tell you yes or no. Other things to keep in mind is that the contact times are going to vary between all of these products. So sometimes it's as short as 1 minute. Other times it can be as high as 10 minutes. So you want to pick something that is conducive to your operations. So the contact time, as a reminder, is the amount of time that it takes the disinfectant to pass into the microorganism and kill the microorganism. So that's important that you're following those contact times. The residue and corrosive properties of these are going to differ as well. So you might kind of have to play around to pick a product that works for you. Some germicidal detergents require dilution. Ready to use is obviously easier. You don't have to measure anything out, but if you are choosing an item that requires dilution, make sure that sterile water is being used for that dilution if you're going to use it in your primary engineering control, and you want to make sure that your employees know how to do that step properly. The next section is garbing. So Section 8 in the regulations lists that all personnel in the controlled or buffer area must be appropriately garbed. So anyone entering the area for any reason, whether it's a pharmacist doing a check or whether you're cleaning or whether you are compounding, you have to be garbed appropriately. So for risk level 1, you need a low particulate and non-shedding gown, hair cover, face mask, beard cover if you have a beard, and gloves. For risk level 2 and 3, it'll be the same that I just mentioned, except you need to now add shoe covers and sterile gloves. There aren't any exemptions when using a compounding aseptic isolator. So make sure that if you're using an isolator, you're still following these garbing procedures. And if you are doing risk level 2 or 3 compounding and you have a compounded aseptic isolator, then the sterile gloves need to be donned inside the RABS unit. So common things that inspectors see regarding garbing include inappropriate garb. Garb is either missing or it's the inappropriate type, or maybe the procedure of garbing isn't correct. So some examples would be exposed hair, so your hair cover is not covering your hair all the way, that there's some hanging out. The mask is not covering the nose, so as we all know, garb can be uncomfortable, it can be hot, and sometimes the compounders will pull their mask down to breathe or whatnot, and that's not appropriate because you need to cover your nose to protect any sort of exposed skin or your breathing activities from kind of contaminating the air. We often see exposed wrists, so maybe the gown or the glove doesn't have a strong enough cuff, so then your gown starts to ride up and exposing your wrist skin, and then a lot of times people don't close their gowns all the way and they're kind of falling off their shoulders, exposing the skin or shoulder area. Sometimes people are just missing entire categories of garb. The most common category that we see is missing beard covers for individuals that have beards, or masks, face masks. And then the inappropriate type of garb that we often see is that the gowns are not non-shedding. So they'll, if you kind of rub the material in between your fingers, you see almost little hairs that are popping up, and those would be considered gowns that are not non-shedding. Sometimes we see the garbing procedure that people use is inappropriate, so maybe they'll wash their hands first before they don their shoe covers, mask, or their hair covers. So shoe covers, mask, and hair covers are obviously going to be the dirtier parts of our body, and if you wash your hands before that, it kind of defeats the purpose, because then you're recontaminating your hands if you are then putting on shoe covers, mask, or a hair cover. So that is sometimes a procedure that we see done incorrectly. And then also sterile gloves for risk level 2 and 3 compounders are donned incorrectly. They just put them on like normal gloves, and that kind of defeats the purpose. So there is a proper way to put on sterile gloves, and I'll kind of review that. So ways to improve compliance for garbing. Again, you want to make sure that your employees are garbing appropriately, so you need to train them to do so. You need to provide, we don't need to, but it's a good idea to provide pictures or signs to assist with those procedures. So if it's a pharmacist or someone that's just not in there as often, it helps them to have a picture or a sign that can remind them of the proper procedure. It's also important to understand and explain to your employees why garbing is so important. I personally think that if you understand the reasoning behind something, it's a little easier to remember that, oh, it's not just something you have to do, but there's an actual reason behind it. So the reason why garbing is so important is that a typical person sheds 30,000 to 40,000 dead skin cells from the surface of their skin every minute. And that's just sitting. When you're actively walking and moving around, that number, I think, triples. The reason that's so important is because microorganisms are then using those dead skin cells as vectors to kind of get around. So on average, just for one skin cell, there are 4 microorganisms. So as you can do the math and imagine, that can be a lot of microorganisms kind of floating and being in your general compounding area. So we want to limit that as much as possible and limit the amount of exposed skin that is available while we're compounding. You want to observe employees to make sure that they are garbing competently, so that would be part of your annual assessment. And then, like I've said, for the other categories, perform frequent audits, kind of peek in on people when they don't know you're looking and see what they're doing. So proper garbing procedure, all these garbing procedures I've done webinars on in the past, so I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights. I'm not going to be as thorough. You guys can review the slides, and hopefully this is kind of old hat for you guys, but proper garbing procedure is to remove your outer garments, makeup, and jewelry. Make sure you're wearing pants or socks, so no skirts or anything that the gown wouldn't cover. You would have exposed skin. And then your garbing order should be from dirtiest to cleanest. So this is the preferred garbing order that we recommend. Depending on your facility design, it might be appropriate to don your shoe covers first instead of the hair cover, and that's fine. Generally, the first 3 items, so the hair cover, face mask, and shoe covers, as long as they're donned in some order before you're washing your hands, we'll accept that as being appropriate. But the preferred order is to do your hair cover and your beard cover, if applicable, then your face masks, shoe covers, wash your hands, non-shedding gown. Best practice, you're going to apply an alcohol-based hand rub to help protect against any tears or glove tears. Then your hands will be kept clean for longer underneath, and then donning your gloves. So for risk level 2 and 3, that would include sterile gloves. So I've highlighted kind of and provided pictures throughout for all the different garbing procedures. So you can see here to the right, there's a picture with my hair hanging out. That would be something that, an example of what we see on inspection that would not be appropriate. So make sure that if your employees have long hair, that they're tying them up appropriately or getting all of the hair into their hair cover. The face mask, again, a couple different types there that I've shown that you can use. The mannequin to the right shows the improper observation that we see where it's underneath the nose. You want to make sure it's covering the bridge of the nose all the way down to the chin. You also want to avoid talking while you're compounding because the saliva and kind of particles moisten the mask, and that actually increases the chance for microorganisms to pass through the mask. Shoe covers, this is going to depend upon where we get asked a lot of times, where should I don my shoe covers? It kind of depends upon your facility. So just a reminder, shoe covers aren't required for risk level 1 compounders. If you're doing risk level 2 or 3, the process will depend on your facility's layout. So anti-areas aren't required by Missouri law. Some of our pharmacies have them, some of them don't. If you do have one, it would be best practice to don your shoe covers using a line of demarcation as you're stepping over from the dirty to the clean side. However, if you don't have an anti-area, you can just don your shoe covers in your designated garbing area. I provided some pictures to kind of demonstrate if you're utilizing a line of demarcation, the proper way to do that. Step 4, you're going to wash your hands. I've kind of outlined the process there, minimum of 30 seconds. You want to use a clock to time the 30 seconds, using a hands-free procedure when you turn off the sink. This is just a diagram that is helpful to remind your employees of the most commonly missed areas when they're washing their hands. So the thumb in between the fingers, the fingertips, these can be helpful to hang up around your sink to help assist your employees. Next step is going to be to don your non-shedding gown. Just a word, seen a lot of yellow isolation gowns out there, so these often have inappropriate cuffs. They can tear really easily, and a lot of times they're not made of the proper material. So that would be if you rub the material in between your fingers, you can kind of see those little hairs. So if you are able to do that on your gown and you see the little hairs, that isn't a non-shedding material. Step 6 is using the alcohol-based surgical hand rub with persistent activity. Again, this isn't required, but it is a best practice to help protect your hands. And then step 7 is to don your gloves. If you're doing risk level 2 or 3, again, it'll be sterile. And then I provided a picture of the exposed wrists over on the right lower hand corner of where the cuff of the gown has crept back and it exposed the wrist. So that would be another example of what we see on inspection. The next is a slide of how to properly don sterile gloves. You basically want to avoid touching the fingers or the inside of the sterile glove with your bare hand. So you can see she's only using her bare hand to touch the folded over part cuff, and then she uses her then sterile hand to assist in donning the other gloves. So that's a proper way to don sterile gloves. This definitely is a learned thing. It takes a lot of practice. There's a lot of videos out there that you can watch to help assist you with that. The next topic of noncompliance is in-use time. So Section 9 in the regulation talks about how long you can use vials or containers during the compounding process. So if you are using a single-dose vial or container or a pharmacy bulk vial or container, so these are going to be items that don't have any added preservative to them, you can use them in compounding, throughout the day for a maximum of 6 hours after it's been punctured by the needle, unless the manufacturer says otherwise. The in-use time has to be placed on the vial or container so everyone knows how long it's good for. And then if you're using a multiple dose vial or container, those are ones that have an antimicrobial preservative, and those may be used in compounding for a maximum of 28 days unless the manufacturer specifies otherwise, and again, those must all be dated appropriately. So common observations that we see with in-use times is that we'll find vials or containers hanging out that have been punctured that don't have any label on them that says how long they're good for. Most commonly including diluent bags that are hanging in the hood, so a bag of sterile water that's being used throughout the day. A lot of times people forget to label those, or bags for TPNs, they're just kind of hanging out with no dates on them. The other type of observation we see is that the in-use times exceed the maximums that I just discussed. So ways to improve compliance for this is to ensure that all of your employees understand that they need to assign the in-use times. A lot of people will create like a quick reference sheet for technicians to help them determine what in-use time to put on their bags. Sometimes they'll provide stickers and things like that. It's also a good idea to perform frequent audits to make sure, just go check around and look to make sure everything has a date. And then whenever you're doing your pharmacist checks, that's a good time to also check that there is an in-use date and that it's the appropriate one on the vial or the container. Next section is Section 9 of the regulations. It refers to aseptic technique. So appropriate quality control methods shall be maintained at all times to ensure proper aseptic technique. So the 3 most common aseptic technique violations we see include the improper use of first air, touch contamination of critical sites, and then the failure to wipe down materials prior to placing them in the primary engineering control. So the improper use of first air, it's a mixture of horizontal and vertical. There isn't one that was greater than the other. It was actually pretty equal. And then touch contamination of critical sites, most specifically we see people touching the plunger. So ways to improve compliance in these areas, again, like I've said, is to provide proper training. You want to make sure that each of your employees gets the same thorough training. A lot of times we'll rely too heavily on people's amount of experience. So maybe you hire someone and, oh, they have 6 years of experience, so your training isn't as in-depth. A lot of times they can pick up bad habits and they'll just continue to use those bad habits unless someone teaches them otherwise. So it's always a good idea to provide the same training for all your employees, whether or not they have experience. You want to provide refresher courses and continuing education to remind them throughout the year. You want to make sure that they are competent, which of course we are looking at during the annual media fill tests. And like I said, with all the other areas, it's always a good idea to perform frequent audits, peek in when people don't know you're looking, and see what they're doing on the day-to-day basis. So just a review for proper use of first air. So the first air is the air that is exiting the HEPA filter, and it's exiting your HEPA filter in a unidirectional airstream, and it is provided at such a velocity that it is able to sweep away any particles and microorganisms from those critical sites. So it's essential to keep the critical sites within the first air at all times, because that's the main reason we're using a primary engineering control, is to keep those particles and microorganisms away from the critical sites. So if we block that first air, you're kind of not utilizing your primary engineering control properly, because it's not able to do its job. So anything that blocks the first air results in turbulent air. The turbulent air isn't able to sweep away harmful particles and microorganisms as efficiently. So if you're not sure where your first air is coming from, it depends upon your primary engineering control and the location of your HEPA filter. So if you have a biological safety cabinet or a compounding aseptic isolator, the first air is typically going to come from the ceiling of the unit. If it's a horizontal flow, so your laminar airflow workbench, it's usually coming from the back of the unit. So I provided a couple pictures that demonstrate improper use of first air. So the picture on the left is a couple different problems. One, that she's not garbed at all, which would be inappropriate, but also that she's using her hand to block the critical sites of the needle, the vial port, and the syringe are all being blocked if that air is coming from, if you imagine the air is blowing at her coming from the back of the unit. So those are all being blocked by the first air. And then the picture on the right is appropriate because the person is garbed appropriately, and then they're leaving space for all those critical sites. In a vertical flow, first air is coming from the ceiling of the primary engineering control. So the picture on the left, there's a giant pharmacy bulk container, and she's holding it straight up and down, so then the air isn't able to reach those critical sites in the middle. Whereas on the right-hand side there, it's being held at an angle so that the critical sites are being bathed in the first air appropriately. I also want to remind people that the placement of the materials in the primary engineering control is also important. So a lot of times people focus on their hand placement, but it's also important to realize that the materials can make a difference too. So the first picture is in a horizontal flow unit. You're kind of looking at it from up above, so you can imagine the air is blowing at the compounder. The picture on the right, or on the left-hand side of that, is that there are two vials, and then the vials in front of those are placed directly in front of them. They're not getting any first air because it's being blocked for the ones behind them. And then with your IV bags, if you're placing them on your work surface, you want to make sure the bag port is pointed towards the HEPA filter and not away from them, because the rest of the bag will kind of block the bag port from receiving the first air. On the right-hand side is a vertical flow, so you can imagine the HEPA filters coming from the ceiling, and a lot of times people will hang items in the hood, and then if they're compounding or placing items directly under that, they aren't receiving first air. So just make sure that material placement is done appropriately. Review of critical sites, so needles, tips, and plungers of the syringes. Like I mentioned earlier, the most common type that we see is the plunger. So make sure to train and educate your employees to avoid touching not only just the plunger, but all critical sites as well. But plunger, for some reason, we see a lot of people touching while they're doing their compounding. Material handling is another area where we see people aren't wiping down the materials appropriately. So all supplies, equipments must be wiped prior to placement in the primary engineering control. If you have an ISO classified area, it's also required that those items are wiped off, sprayed and wiped down before they enter the ISO classified area. So if you have an anti or a buffer area, they should be sprayed down. So if you have any sort of ISO classified clean room, then the items are going to be wiped down twice, as they're entering the ISO classified area, and then again as they're being placed into your primary engineering control. If you have a controlled area without the ISO classification, items are then wiped down once just prior to being placed into the primary engineering control. I get asked a lot about the wiping, if that's really needed, and the answer is yes, it's needed. It's essential for spore removal, because spraying alone will not remove the spores, so it's the mechanical action of the wiping that actually helps get rid of those spores. So the next area is the maintenance of controlled or buffer areas. So this is section 7 of the regulations, and it basically speaks to maintaining that area appropriately to minimize the risk for contamination. So common observations we see are exposed drywall, often near carts or chairs where things are bumping into the wall. The picture on the far right would be an example of that. Exposed wood or laminate, so in older kind of clean rooms, there'll be counters and things that get peeled off, and then you can see the wood or the laminate underneath. And then areas of rust are areas for particle generation and hard to clean. So again, you want to get in your buffer or controlled area and conduct repairs as they're needed. Include this inspection as part of your monthly cleaning activities. So as you're cleaning, keep an eye out for anything that might need to be updated or repaired. So the next section is section 20. It is remedial investigation. So this is a new section that was added with the sterile compounding revision. And it requires that a pharmacy completes a remedial investigation for two different instances. So one is that any required sampling or testing demonstrates that a colony forming unit or a CFU count is exceeding USP Chapter 797 recommended action levels. The second scenario would be if a highly pathogenic microorganism is detected, and this is regardless of the CFU count. So you could have just one CFU. If that's identified in any preparation or an ISO classified area, you have to do a remedial investigation. If the remedial investigation is occurring in an ISO 5 or ISO 7 classified area, no further compounding shall be performed until resampling shows a suitable state of control. And then also the pharmacy has to notify the board within 7 days if a highly pathogenic microorganism is detected. So common observations we see regarding remedial investigations include pharmacies not completing a remedial investigation when it's required, or they say they've done an investigation but nothing's really been documented. So either the sampling results are ignored or people just aren't documenting it appropriately. Failure to conduct resampling of the area, so maybe a pharmacy will do a thorough cleaning but then they don't resample the area. Continuing to compound in an ISO 5 or 7 area while they're waiting for the resampling results. And then failure to notify the board whenever they find highly pathogenic microorganisms. So I just wanted to kind of review this whole section since it's a newer section for us. So first, how do you determine if you need to do a remedial investigation? So once you get your air and surface sampling results back, you're reviewing those for the presence of microorganisms. So the first thing you want to look at is the number of CFUs that you've gotten back. If you decide to identify your microorganisms, then you also will be looking at the type of microorganisms that have been grown. So if you it is not required to identify the microorganisms, but if that is something that your pharmacy decides to do, then you also need to analyze your identification results. So you're looking at CFU count and the type that came back. So first off, you want to count the number of CFUs identified and compare it to the Chapter 797 levels that I've kind of listed here before. So for an example, ISO class 5 for your air sample, anything greater than 1 would exceed your 797 action levels, so then you'd have to do an remedial investigation. If the next thing you would look at is the identification. So if your pharmacy decides to identify the CFUs, that's when you want to look at the genus or the species to determine if any highly pathogenic microorganisms are present. Again, this is going to be regardless of the number of CFUs if they exist in an ISO classified area. So you're looking for gram-negative rods, coagulase-positive staph, molds or funguses, and yeast. And this is a very broad definition. There are, it just kind of includes everything. It's not really stratified in any way. So once you've decided that you have to do a remedial investigation, you need to quarantine your affected area. If the affected area is within an ISO 5 or ISO 7 classified area, compounding must stop in that area while you're doing your investigation. It's also a good idea to consider doing Class J arrangements in case your pharmacy has to close down during a remedial investigation. Once you have done resampling to show that you have a microbial state of control, you can then resume compounding. So I've listed, running short on time here, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I've listed here a lot of potential sources for the microorganisms and ways that you can take corrective action. So you can go ahead and read through those yourself and take any corrective actions you need. And then once you have done the corrective actions, resample your affected area, make sure you have a state of control. You want to then document all of the events that took place and then notify the board. for the notification, you can send me an email or you can mail it to the board office and they'll send it to me as well. Risk level 3, this is just the type of most common observations that you can do if you have a risk level 3. So failure to perform surface sampling in all the ISO classified areas every 30 days, improper sterility testing, so not following USP 71, improper sample size, or maybe you're not doing the sterility test when you're required to, so bulk solutions that people will make up, and then inappropriate sterilization methods, including things like sterilizing filters, not being pharmaceutical grade. So that kind of leads us to the end of our webinar. Unfortunately, I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but if you do have questions, you can go ahead and email them to me at kd.diebold@pr.mo.gov. And then just a reminder that the Patient Safety Conference is October 24th. We got some free CE, 5.5 hours worth. It should be a good thing to attend if you're able to. It's in St. Charles, and you can sign up for that on the board's website. Once the webinar is completed, go ahead and click close for the webinar has ended. The survey will open. Go ahead and submit that within 48 hours to receive your CE credit. If you have questions, go ahead and email compliance@pr.mo.gov. Thanks for joining me today.